All right, Marcello, Ienca, welcome to the Neutralized podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Why do you think that we need human rights now that we're having all of these new neurotechnologies being developed?
I would probably say for a twofold reason. The first reason is because of the importance of the human brain. The human brain is arguably the most important organ of the human body. It governs not only life-maintaining functions such as respiration, circulation, but also all those so-called mental faculties, so cognition, perception, emotions, and it's the main side of behavioral control. So all those things that make us human and um, underlie our personal identity, agency, and all those fundamental ethical legal notions um, that are very at core of our societal systems and values.
Right.
So this is probably the simplest answer. But there is also an historical and pragmatic reason for that, I would say, namely that human rights were notably developed um, before the technological innovation led to systems that have the capacity to directly interface the human brain. And therefore, they do not spell out specific requirements on how the human brain should or should not be accessed, altered, and simulated um, using advanced neurotechnologies, especially in combination with artificial intelligence. So I would say there's a twofold reason, and then probably I would add also a third reason, namely that uh, human brain tissue, and human brain data are inherent to all human beings, regardless of their nationality, background, culture, sex, and so on. And therefore, they are very suitable entities for protection at the level of fundamental human rights.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So, in your work of suggesting new human rights,
Right.
what can you give us an overview of what are the human rights that you are suggesting get added to the currently existing human rights?
Well, we suggested four new human rights that are specific to the neurocognitive domain, which we call neuro rights. And these are the right to cognitive liberty, the right to mental privacy, the right to mental integrity, and the right to psychological continuity. But I would like to clarify that while we made this proposal, we mentioned this for new human rights as potential candidates
Mm.
to become new human rights. It's
Right.
not a postulation, but it's really a proposal, a suggestion. There's a lot of debate among legal scholars about the so-called rights proliferation, which is the risk that if we turn into rights anything, any moral desiderata, so anything that is morally desirable, there is a risk of diminishing or even degrading the importance that value that rights have in our society and our legal systems. So I'm personally fairly agnostic about this four new rights should be considered as brand new rights or rather as specifications or specific instances or requirements that we spell out,
Right.
and also as potentially evolutionary interpretations of existing rights. So one
Right.
obvious example is the right to mental privacy, which is an extension or specification of the general right to privacy. Um, would you would you like me to spell out these four new rights into details?
Yeah, please start with cognitive liberty. Yeah.
Yeah. So cognitive liberty can be sort of introduced as a prerequisite of all other neurospecific rights, because it protects the right of individuals to make free and competent decisions about the use of neurotechnology. So it's both a positive and a negative right. On the positive side, it ensures and protects the right and ability of people to make free use of neurotechnology if they wish to do so, for purposes such as brain monitoring or even cognitive enhancement. So it protects the right of people to enhance their cognitive abilities here using neurotechnology. But at the same time, it's a negative right that prevents unauthorized, unconsented access to a person neural computation, or unconsented and alterations or modification of the neural computation by third parties. So, for example, in the positive sense, the right to cognitive liberty allow people who want to try transcranial direct current stimulation for enhancement purposes to do so. But it also prevents employers, for example, from requiring compelled neuromodulation or access to, for example, electroencephalography data of their employees.
Right.
So it has this twofold value.
Would this human right then entail that all substances, all drugs become legal in every country of the world? Because the human right is like in every country of the world which agree to the human rights, of course.
Yeah, that's a good question. My focus is primarily on neurotechnology, not much on neuropharmacology. But I must say I haven't thought extensively on this issue, but I would, in general terms, I would say yes. One implication of the right to cognitive liberty as applied to pharmacology would be the legalization of drugs. Provided that this does not conflict with other rights. So, for example, again, unauthorized use of drugs by third parties, that would be prevented. But that people might have a general right to modulate their neural activity. This might also be applicable to pharmacology as well.
And that's negative right, that you have the right to not be manipulated neurochemically by unauthorized parties. That very much ties into the other proposed human rights of mental privacy.
Yeah.
Would you describe it in a bit more detail for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So mental privacy is basically, as I said before, is the application, the extension of privacy rights to the cognitive domain. So it's designed to protect brain information from unconsented access by third parties. Now, this is an instance of general privacy rights, but what is questionable, what is not clear yet, is what is the position, what is the location of brain data in the current data protection landscape. So if we consider brain data as general personal data, or personal identifiable information, as it's called in the United States, then it would fall under the protections, for example, of the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. But there is still uncertainty about where brain data should be located in the current data protection landscape. And this is something that my colleagues and I and some other researchers globally are trying to figure out at the moment. And there is also one second argument. So besides this sort of taxonomic uncertainty, there is a second argument in favor of uh, specification of the requirements for privacy in the mental and cognitive domain. And this is the fact that brain activity can be potentially recorded from an individual without their direct awareness and without their direct comprehension of the kind of information that is being collected from them. So for example, if I am using, for example, consumer electroencephalography PCI for, let's say, gaming purposes, then there is still background information that can be read and accessed that is not directly relevant for the task that I'm performing in that particular moment. But that's redundant background information that can be accessed, and companies might have a commercial interest in mining those data for whatever purposes, for psychographic profiling, for training the algorithms, and so on. So since there is no conscious control in the filtering of brain data flows, this creates a problem, because our privacy right, privacy is both a right and an ability. And as an ability, it's based on the assumption that people have the ability to filter in and out the flow of information and make conscious decisions about what information they want to seclude to the public, and which information they are fine with sharing with the public. But in order to have this ability to filter in and out the flows of information, you need to have conscious rational control over that information. This is something that cybersecurity experts know very well when they say that the best antivirus is the brain. By that they mean that the best protection you have for securing your data is using your brain and making conscious decisions about which websites is safe to visit and which ones is not safe. But this ability of having a center of conscious rational control of the flow of information does not apply when you are actually processing data about that same center that is supposed to process that information. There is a sort of inception problem there, and this creates an additional problem, I would say.
I'm not sure I understand that. Are you saying that someone who is having an EEG measuring their brain activity, that they cannot consciously influence what the readings will be? Like, let's say I'm educated in how EEGs work. I know what sort of mental activity that they measure. Couldn't I then try to think about a specific object to guide?
To put it simple, the problem, this so-called inception problem, is that the best tool you have in order to protect brain data is the brain itself. So the best tool you have to protect that set of data and computations is the same processor of data and computation that you want to protect. This simply creates an additional problem from my personal point of view. But if you want to practical examples of how privacy rights might be spelled out in the years to come, the most direct applications I would see are not necessarily in the area of mind reading. When I talk about mental privacy, a lot of people do a sort of a slippery slope argument, and they immediately assume that what is at stake is mind reading. So the possibility of reading the content of thoughts from human reasoning. And this might be an instance of scenarios that are protected under the mental privacy right. But this is a far-fetched scenario. I think we're very far from reading the content of thoughts, because in order to read the content of thoughts, you need to understand and decode the language of thoughts, the language of the brain. And we don't have, we are very far from having decoded the language of the brain. So I personally think, this is a logical possibility, and with advancing technology, with better recording techniques and better AI analytics, we might get there at some point, at where we can decode human thought and their content. But I think there are privacy-sensitive inferences that you can make about the human brain that do not involve decoding human thought at all. So, for example, you can access data that correlate with the neurological signatures of disease. So you can be, for example, a user of a consumer device, and that the data that the device is able to collect can be, if adequately mined, can reveal basically biomarkers of disease, say an increased risk of developing a mild cognitive decline or even Alzheimer's disease dementia in the next 2-3 years. And if not adequately secured, and if accessed by third parties, for example, health insurance providers or employers, that information can lead to significant harm to the data generator. So, for example, if say my company knows that I'm going to develop Alzheimer's disease in the next 2 years, they might want to terminate my contract, or my health insurance provider might want to increase my premiums. And here we are not reading anything remotely close to human thought, but still that information can be used to make inferences that are quite privacy sensitive.
Right.
And so in this implication of mental privacy, I think it's more and more important in the big data ecosystem that we live in. Because there's a lot of research, for example, in digital phenotyping that shows that you can actually make quite reliable inferences about people's future probability of developing a certain mental illness by looking even at indirect measures, such as your mobile data, smartphone data. So this is really an example of basically making privacy-sensitive inferences from data that are prima facie known sensitive, right? And this raises an entire set of challenges when it's applied to the neurocognitive domain, which is extremely private by default.
Yeah. Yeah, I like your description of the first two human rights. Could you please describe the human rights of, or rather the suggested human rights of, mental integrity?
Yeah, I mean, mental integrity is, among the four we propose, is the only one that we haven't phrased ourselves. Actually, also the other one have some link to the previous ethical and legal literature, but the right to mental integrity is actually already recognized in international law. It's in the Article 3 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, for example. And there it's strongly associated to the promotion of mental health. So universal access to mental health services. And it's basically the counterpart of the right to physical integrity. So what we suggest is basically a reconceptualization of this right, or a conceptual expansion of this right to mental integrity, as to protect also against illicit and harmful uses of neurotechnology. So the scenarios that I've described before in relation to the right to mental privacy, they all involve unauthorized access to information, to data, and through the processing of this data also to certain sets of information. The right to mental integrity should be the counterpart, that the counterpart right that protects not just the access to data, but also protects from the harms that that access can generate, especially if it's combined with an alteration of
Mm-hmm.
the functioning either of the underlying neurobiology of the human brain or of the functioning of the device. So to give
Mm.
you a very simple example, if you are imagine a patient with Parkinson's disease, and you are a user of a deep brain stimulation, which
Mm-hmm.
is an implanted type of neurotechnology, which has shown extremely promising effects in reducing the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, especially the essential tremor. And then, so you significantly rely on that technology in order to, function normally in your daily life, in order uh, to eat, in order to go to the restroom and independently, and so on. If a malevolent hacker intercept the signal of your DBS, even using a very simple hack, without accessing any information, but simply by increasing or decreasing intensity, that can lead to significant harm
Yeah.
to you, or simply disrupting the functioning of the device.
Mm-hmm.
That can lead to significant harm. And this kind of scenarios are not sci-fi. These are, very simple hacks. A lot of brain-computer interfaces rely on wireless channels, such as the Wi-Fi, on the Bluetooth channel, and these wireless channels are notoriously very easy to intercept. Um, and the kind of harm that you can create is in a sort of gray zone, in a sort of regulatory no man's land at the moment, because it's unclear whether it should be regarded as harm to property or if it should be regarded as harm to a person. You know,
Mm.
from a prima facie, you could say, well, you're disrupting functioning in a device, so should be considered similar as, just destroying your smartphone, right?
Yeah.
Or destroying, another piece of equipment that you might want to use on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
But given the significant function that the brain-computer interface has in a daily life of, for example, a Parkinson's disease patient, um, you might argue, and I personally would say so, that this rather qualifies as a harm to the person and to the
Mm.
mental integrity of the person,
Mm.
rather than as a harm to the property.
Mm.
Because that technological system is so important in the functioning of the person, and it's so much integrated in the motor and cognitive loop of that person,
Mm-hmm.
that should rather be considered as a sort of, peripheral
Mm.
extension of that person's brain,
Mm.
rather than as an independent piece of technological equipment, just like any other property that a certain person might have.
Mm. And what was your suggested solution to this current dilemma?
What is the dilemma?
So the current legal dilemma between, is it property or is it the person?
Well, that's an open question. I'm actually this is part of my current investigation. There is an interesting theory. It's actually an hypothesis rather than a theory in the philosophy of mind, called
Mm-hmm.
the extended mind theory. And this hypothesis says basically that if you have an external system, let's say a certain technology, then functions in such a way that if it was implanted in a person's head, if it was part of a person's brain, we would have no doubt to consider that as part of a cognitive process, of a
Mm-hmm.
cognitive system. Therefore, it should be considered part of that system.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an argument based on, it was originally developed by two philosophers of mind called David Chalmers and Andy Clark. And this analogy that I just made, they call it the parity principle. So if you have basically an external system that functions, it's sort of functionally isomorph to an internal element of a person's cognitive system, say a certain brain area that functions in a certain way, then the mere fact that it's located outside the skull, it's no justification for considering it as independent, as unrelated to the cognitive system. And actually, they take it this argument even farther than simple neurotechnology. They say that even things like a smartphone or a notebook, you know, when you take notes on with pencil and paper, they can function under certain circumstances as part of your internal cognitive system, as part of your memory, for example.
Yeah.
And I think that some instances of this argument can offer a good theoretical substrate for the discussions that we are facing in the field of neuroethics and neurolaw. So personally, I would think that if you destroy, either disrupt function or brain-computer interface that is, you know, very well integrated in the perceptual, cognitive, or emotional functioning of a person, that type of damage should be rather conceptualized as harm to the person and not as harm to the property.
Moving on to the fourth and last proposed human rights, psychological continuity.
Right. Well, this can basically be interpreted as a subset of mental integrity. And that's a subset of mental integrity that is focused on a personal identity. So psychological continuity is also a concept that is deeply rooted in philosophical discussions. Famous philosopher Derek Parfit used this language to basically refer to his theory of personal identity. So the right to psychological continuity should be designed to basically preserve people's personal identity and the continuity of their mental life from unconsented external alteration. So, you know, what makes us the same person throughout life? What is it in your view? Why do you think that you are the same person now than you were two years ago, or even half an hour ago?
Right. So I've practiced a lot of mindfulness, and I've read a lot about mindfulness, and core to that philosophy is the concept of no self. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. So I don't personally really believe that there is any lasting me, but I guess the feeling of me is created in social situations, I'd say.
Right.
So,
yeah. I mean, that's exactly the reason why I was asking you this question, because if you want to have, you know, a purely reductionist approach, and you say, well, I am still myself because I have exactly the same neural circuits and exactly the same neurons that I had 10 years ago. That's a very bad answer, because that's to a large extent empirically false. You know, neural circuits change. So, you know, basic neurobiology doesn't give us a good argument in favor of considering ourselves as the same persons as before. What we call psychological continuity is way more linked to our personal beliefs, right? So we tend to have a certain degree of continuity in the beliefs we hold, which doesn't mean that we don't change our beliefs. It doesn't mean that we don't change our mental states. We do that all the time, but we try to do that in a consistent manner. And when we do change our beliefs, we tend to be aware of that change and consider that modification in our system of beliefs as part of our identity. But if, you know, every second I would have a different belief in relation to literally anything, then I would hardly consider myself as a subject of personal identity, of something that can be
Right.
defined personal identity. So that's why we think that people should have this right to psychological continuity, which should prevent this unconsented external alterations. The word unconsented is very important because we change our mental states very often,
Yeah.
even as a consequence of very simple chemical stimuli. If I drink coffee, I increase my alert, attention, and concentration spans. If I drink alcohol, I tend to engage in types of behavior that I wouldn't engage in if I'm sober.
Yeah.
But what is important? So you cannot prevent alterations of psychological continuity per se, but we can prevent unconsented alterations of psychological continuity.
Could you
So
though?
to start with the alcohol analogy, it's fine if you want to, drink alcohol, but it's not fine if someone just puts alcohol in your glass without your consent.
Yeah.
Just tells you, oh, here's water, and then it's actually vodka, and then you drink it, because then you haven't freely chosen the consequences of that action. So the same applies to neurotechnology. If you want to use a certain neural device to change, to alter your cognitive or emotional processes, imagine that in 20 years from now, we have neurotechnologies that can make you significantly more alert, or even more social. And then you want to do that, I think you should have the right to do so, provided that there is no unconsented alteration by third parties. So the right to psychological continuity, it's both a sub-right of the right to mental integrity and the right to cognitive liberty.
So psychological continuation is really the right to not have external third parties that are human or corporations alter your mental state, your psychological state rather.
Humans, corporations, or algorithms. It doesn't have to be necessarily, another agent. It doesn't have to be another human or group of humans. In the so-called closed-loop brain-computer interfaces, you have embedded AI algorithms that automatically self-calibrate. And there are scenarios where this AIs can actually have a substantial impact in the behavioral outputs that you produce as a BCI user. And in those circumstances, it's unclear whether the final action is the one that you originally intended, or if your decision-making is sort of being hijacked by the automated algorithmic components.
Right.
This is something very relevant to a class of brain-computer interfaces called neuroadaptive brain-computer interfaces. And this is also something that would fall under this category, not necessarily, sort of neurocriminal scenarios where another actor, another person takes control, but also scenarios where you have AI algorithms that malfunction or that override the signal generated by the human agent, and so on.
Right. I suspect that it may be hard to draw the line of what external factors should be included in this, right?
Yeah, but I mean, that's what the law is all about, right? It's about defining circumstances and requirement and specifying cases. So, this is what we provide is a general ethical legal framework but it's not the end of the story. Then a lot of work needs to be done in order to define all these specifications and all these occurrences.
Right. Do you think that there are any neurotechnologies that are commercially available right now that people use that put people at risk for their brains being hacked?
So are you asking if malicious brain hacking is a concrete possibility of today?
Yeah. Is it a concrete possibility, and is it happening?
Well, simple answer is certainly yes. So any computer device is hackable. So are brain-computer interfaces. They are based on computer systems. They process digital data, so they are exposed to the same vulnerabilities as any other computer system.
Right.
But then, of course, a different question is what kind of hacking, what kind of malicious hacks are possible today, given the current level of technological sophistication. And as I said before, what is currently possible is very simple hacks that can still have very negative consequences for the users. For example, disrupting function, intercepting the signal to increase or decrease intensity, or even simply, destroying the device. That is something that can have very negative consequences for the user if the user is a neurological patient. Again, going to the example from before, Parkinson's disease patient who uses a deep brain stimulation. There are also experimental studies that show that it's possible to hack data generated by a brain-computer interface. For example, electroencephalography data. There are studies that manage to, with quite some reliability, to predictably guess the information that was coded in the EEG signal. Again, this is not, I need to clarify because, a lot of people get this wrong. This is not mind reading. It's not, this kind of hacks are not based on reading the content of thoughts. But these hacks already are sufficiently sophisticated to access signals, for example, EEG signals, that if adequately analyzed and mined, they can be used to make privacy-sensitive inferences. And then, of course, the simplest of all hacks is just data leakage. So, that the data that consumer neurotechnologies are generating today is simply going to, be added on top of the already quite extensive digital profiles that commercial entities have from users, together with online search queries, digital health information, smartphone data, wearables data, and so on. So it's just another piece of the puzzle that will make the puzzle more one step closer to its completion. So this brain data that are leaked from consumer neurotechnology applications could contribute to creating more extensive and comprehensive psychographic profiles, for example. And it's not surprising from my personal point of view that social media giants such as Facebook are so much interested in investing in brain-computer interfacing technology. I don't think that they're doing it because they really think that there is a significant commercial advantage in typing with your brain directly. I think that the real commercial advantage that they see is accessing that additional class of data and merging that data set with the data sets that they already own, which are huge, and creating very comprehensive psychographic profiles.
Right. Is this a risk for someone who may want to improve their cognitive performance and go online and buy a transcranial direct current stimulation device?
Again, in principle, yes. In reality, no, because the consumer market is very small at the moment. So the marginal risk for a criminal hacker to build a hacking model and attack that specific person is very low. In order to justify the risk that you take in engaging in criminal activities, you need to have a sufficient reward.
Right.
And now the number of users is so limited that it doesn't make so much sense for hackers to create sophisticated hacking models. There are so many other technologies that you can hack today that are way more widely distributed, and there, the reward would very much justify the risk if you share that basic commitment to criminality. So I think there is a big gap between what is experimentally possible and what is likely to happen in reality, because what is likely to happen in reality does not depend only on what is experimentally possible, but also most importantly on what makes sense and what are the socio-technical conditions for that to happen. But if you are a user of a consumer neuromodulation device, the greater risk that you face is not having your data accessed without your consent. It's not that somebody can hijack the signal. The greater risk is that the device simply doesn't work, and that you have spent your money and following certain hyperbolic marketing claims that were not based on any evidence whatsoever. And you're basically just wasting your money and wasting your time and wasting your data, because
right.
Even if the device doesn't work, the company that produces that device is still going to access and process your data.
Yeah. What's your understanding of the efficacy of these devices that are commercially available for cognitive enhancement purposes?
Well, I've been very vocal. At least I'm perceived as as a vocal opponent to consumer neurotechnology, but I'm actually not. I'm actually someone who thinks that it's very important to have private company, private sector investment in neurotechnology, and I think that it's very important to have consumer applications of neurotechnology. And I believe that for a very simple reason, because given the global burden of neurological disorders and mental illness worldwide, we really need to expand the quality and quantity of measurements about the human brain in order to create, large-scale data repositories and train algorithms to analyze those big volumes of data and make sense of them. As Tom Insel once said, you cannot cure what you cannot measure. So we need to, measure brain activity in order to cure brain or mental illness. So I think that developments in consumer neurotech can help us get there, because they can help us get more ubiquitous data, as we have seen with, wearable devices and smartphones and so on. So I'm very positive about this. What I'm negative is the misuse of these technologies. So I really want to make sure that as this consumer neurotechnologies advance, we have created the right ethical and legal conditions for this sector of technology development to flourish without causing risks or even harms to people. And I think this is a very important distinction.
What do you personally do for cognitive enhancements?
Well, as I said before, to my knowledge, I'm very skeptical today about using TDCS or something similar to increase my cognitive performance. Things like sleeping well, having regular sleep patterns, physical exercise. These are all things that have shown scientific evidence of being much more useful towards cognitive enhancement than actual direct neuromodulation.
Right.
That being said, I would be, very first in line to use TDCS or tax or whatever else in 10 years from now, if there are if there is a clear scientific evidence of their efficacy and safety.
Right.
And there are some studies, in experimental settings, not in the real world, that show some promising potential. So I'm open to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, seems to me that almost for any intervention, except for sleep, exercise, and some dietary interventions, mainly just skipping the sugar and not eating way too much or way too little. But except for that, almost all cognitive enhancement interventions need a lot more evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is something that we're trying to do here at Neutralize, actually, trying to enable people to, in an online application, take psychometric tests after using nootropic compounds, so cognitive enhancement compounds. Yeah. See?
But just to give you an example, I mentioned that there are certain technologies that are showing some promising potential.
Yeah.
In the experimental settings. Your readers might be interested in checking out a study that appeared in Nature Neuroscience. I think it was last year.
Mm-hmm.
It was around last spring, which basically use EEG measurements in combination with TACS, transcranial alternate current stimulation, in healthy adults age 60 to 76. So older people,
Mm-hmm.
seniors. And after 25 minutes of stimulation, this resulted in rapid improvement in working memory.
Mm-hmm.
And this improvement outlasted the 50-minute post-stimulation period. So I think this is, what probably most people would qualify as cognitive enhancement.
Mm-hmm.
It's really like an enhancement in working memory performance in healthy subjects.
Right.
There is a lot of debate about whether enhancement should incorporate or not therapy, and restoring normal or baseline function in impaired people, or if it's just about over the normal, over the baseline improvement.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that would also fit in the narrow definition of enhancement. But the problem, the real challenge that we have ahead of us is how do we transfer this first promising experiments into utilizable consumer applications?
Right.
Because there are huge translational barriers in neuroscience and consumer neurotechnology in particular. So it's going to really take a lot of time and a lot of hard work to transfer this promising experimental results into real world applications. And there are a lot of bottlenecks that need to be, and a lot of translational barriers that need to be overcome.
Yeah. Do you have any idea of how, or rather, I should ask, first of all, could you give a couple of examples of those barriers?
Well, yeah, one typical barrier is things work in the lab, they don't work anymore when they are tested in the real world. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of problems for this, usually because the design, the study design in the lab was not adequately sketched. There were some methodological limitations, or the devices were not adequately tested with their end user groups, or the sample size of the study was too small. That also happens very, very often. And sometimes, there is also a more general problem, namely that there is, it's much cooler to develop a new product and obtain funding for developing a new product than for implementing existing prototypes. Implementation is not perceived by investors as cool as design and development. So there is always a lot of money that flows into design and development, but then a lot of startups face a lot of financial limitation when it comes to implementing what they've done. And that's a totally dysfunctional system. This is also where you could intervene and try to remove these translational barriers.
Thank you, Marcello, for coming on the Neutralized podcast.
Thank you. It was a pleasant conversation.